I watched a movie called The Blackening a while ago, which was about this group of friends that go to a cabin in the woods and have to play a Jumanji-esque game revolving around black stereotypes in pop culture in order to not get killed by generic masked murderer number 5037. And while I was watching it, I kept asking myself two different questions. First, exactly what kind of drugs and how many of them would I need to take to suppress the memory of ever having watched this movie from my mind? And what was this movie even trying to be? It feels to me that this movie tried to cash in on a trend over the last few years of horror comedies built around social themes, particularly drawing on the works of Jordan Peele. The movie did alright with critics and audiences, so I admit that these are my opinions and I'm clearly not the target audience for this kind of movie. But at the same time, I get the idea that this movie wanted me to think about what it was saying, when it really wasn't saying all that much. And while watching it, I couldn't help but feel that these other movies were so much better at delivering both meaningful social commentary and witty satire on similar subject matter while not shying away from the horror aspect of their stories either. So today, I'd like to touch on what I think makes good horror comedy, and how a movie like this falls short of the mark set by movies like these. If you asked a person what they thought of when they heard the phrase horror comedy, chances are you'd probably get a wide variety of responses, because it can be difficult to distinguish what makes a movie a horror comedy, as opposed to a horror movie with comedy in it, or a comedy with horror elements. And when you throw terms like satire and social commentary into the mix, things can get even more muddled, because both serious and comedic movies can be satirical, even though the term satire usually has connotations associated with humor, and therefore comedies. In this context, it makes sense why a movie like The Blackening would lean much harder on jokes as a vehicle for making fun of cultural stereotypes and horror movie tropes. But does the fact that it does this in a horror-themed setting automatically make it horror comedy? Some would argue that it does. Horror comedy has a pretty long history, going all the way back to early parodies of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and in the realm of cinema, all the way back to old Abbott and Costello films. Other movies like Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice in the 80s and Shaun of the Dead in the 2000s follow in the spirit of this tradition and make it seem like horror comedies are just when you do comedies with a horror aesthetic. But then, on the other side of that spectrum, you have movies like Cabin in the Woods or Get Out, which do engage in humor as a vehicle for satire, but also indulge in more disturbing ideas and images to unsettle the viewer in a way that's more reminiscent of traditional horror. Other movies like Barbarian and the Scream franchise lean even harder in the direction of horror, but still have humorous moments intended to introduce levity. Is a movie a horror comedy if it's a horror movie with funny moments? And if not, then what makes movies like The Blackening a horror comedy when it's just a comedy that uses horror elements? I think the problem is that the usage of the term horror comedy or comedy horror is relatively arbitrary, and different people will draw the line at different places. But I'm not satisfied with just saying, oh well, horror comedy is when a movie has both scary and funny things in it, because that just describes a wide array of movies that don't typically fall under that umbrella. I think the real trick to dissecting whether something really qualifies as horror comedy is in the purpose behind the project in question, and the ways in which humor and terror are synthesized to convey the film's ideas. Take a movie like Jordan Peele's Nope. Right off the bat, this movie tells you, hey pal, this is a scary movie, but it's gonna be funny too. Just look at our title, isn't it quirky? And to be sure, there are many funny moments in Nope. But as with many of Jordan Peele's other films, there's just as much to be afraid of as there is to laugh at. The movie isn't content to throw a silly premise at you and play it up for jokes while pretending to say something meaningful about society. It wants you to feel uncomfortable. It wants you to be genuinely repulsed by what you're watching. It wants you to leave the theater feeling like you've seen something you shouldn't have seen. And it's the same with Peele's other films like Get Out and Us, even though I think they both strike the balance of horror and comedy to different degrees of success. What makes this recipe for horror comedy so impactful is that At their core, both horror and comedy are designed to do the same thing, make you question what you think you know. Ever since the days of ancient Greece, comedy has been a method to get people to notice the absurdity in things about their culture and their way of living that they take for granted. Likewise, ever since the 18th century, horror has been used as a way to force people to confront unpleasant contradictions in their worldview, like how the titular character in Bram Stoker's Dracula was written to challenge the sensibilities of Victorian readers that a person of high social standing and outwardly presentable appearance could commit monstrous, even demonic acts of evil. When done well, comedy and horror both work to upend our perspective and make us reconsider things which we've grown accustomed to, which is why they work so well when blended together. That's why I think movies like Nope, Get Out, and Cabin in the Woods deserve the title of horror comedy as a distinct genre, more than just comedies with horror movie dressing, because these films use both horror and humor as vehicles for insight, which is something that's harder to find in a movie like The Blackening, where the Family Guy-style reference humor and quote-unquote satire is designed to merely poke fun at tropes and contradictions rather than drive home a deeper message about their implications. Get Out bases its humor in pointing out the awkward and racially ignorant tendencies of well-meaning white liberals, while simultaneously drawing attention to more sinister intentions that sometimes lurk beneath those tendencies. And a movie like Cabin in the Woods uses its humor to satirize horror movie tropes, but does so in a way that also acts as a deeper commentary on the nature of fate, free will, and self-sacrifice for the greater good. To me, good horror comedy is about two things primarily. It's about having something to say, and it's about saying it while using both humor and horror to dislodge people's sense of certainty and familiarity in order for the message to be made clear. Now, obviously, this is only my arbitrary boundary line for the genre, and I completely respect anyone who thinks that the term horror comedy can apply just as easily to a movie that doesn't aim for some deeper meaning, or that only uses horror aesthetics as a backdrop for comedy. I get that. And while I don't think a movie like The Blackening works very well as either a horror comedy or even just a straight-up comedy, I recognize that's purely a matter of taste. However, I think there is something to be said for why horror and comedy work so well in tandem beyond just being two great tastes that taste great together. And while I think it's fine to make a movie just for laughs, I always respect movies more when they use laughs and scares as a way of speaking to something more.